Welcome, welcome to the Philosophical Research Society. I'm Alex McDonald. I am the Theater and Events Manager and a programmer here at PRS. I'm still not accustomed to seeing myself that big on the screen, but who's here for the first time tonight at PRS? I love that at all the other events, all these hands go up, and then Mitch's events, it's just a smattering of hands. We know you're in the right place here. But for those who are here for the first time, I do want to tell you a little bit about this space. The Philosophical Research Society was founded in 1934 by a Canadian-born comparative religion scholar, author, lecturer, mystic in his own right, Manly Palmer Hall. Hall started his career as a Christian pastor and found that his congregants were asking questions of him that biblical text alone did not provide sufficient answers for. Already interested in world religion and spirituality, he boarded a ship in his 20s, in the 1920s, and went around the world to learn from gurus and teachers and ascetics, and went to Japan and China, Iran and Egypt, all over, and studied world spiritualities, looking for sort of the through lines through all of them, and came back and wrote what's considered one of the cornerstone texts of 20th century esoteric literature for seekers of all sorts, called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. He gained quite a following here of people that were thirsty for just that type of knowledge, looking for just those sorts of answers. And originally the Philosophical Research Society was sort of a traveling salon that went from lecture halls and living rooms, wherever people would congregate to learn and to listen to Manly speak. Eventually he realized that LA deserved its own space for all of this, and his growing huge book collection of rare texts from around the world needed a place to live. So they broke ground here in just a little after the society was founded. In 1936, the space opened. The library has barely changed since the 1930s and houses 30,000 rare books from around the world of comparative religion, occult, esoteric knowledge, past life regression, Atlantis, all sorts of stuff up there. It's a really fascinating space, and if you haven't visited, you must. We are open there Thursdays and Fridays from 12 to 6 and do host some events there. But we are now, as you saw, a 501c3 arts and culture nonprofit, and that has allowed us to reach new audiences who might not otherwise be reached, and who might come, like I said there, for a John Carpenter's Dark Star on 16 millimeter, but then never have heard of Mitch's work and come back the next night and take this in and get their minds blown and be just where they're meant to be. So I believe you all are where you're meant to be tonight. I want to, without further ado, introduce this evening and our special guest. Mitch is a dear friend of PRS, and one of Manly's, if you were here when he was last here and I introduced you, heard me say this before, but one of Manly's core philosophies was that this wisdom should not, by the kind of Webster's dictionary definition, remain esoteric. It should not remain hidden. This is knowledge that should reach people of all stripes wherever they are in their lives, because he felt it could really help all mankind. And I feel like Mitch really carries that torch forward. I don't know anybody, any other scholar in this field who is as sensitive and conscious of what's going on in the world today and what's going on in people's day-to-day lives and how these things, how this wisdom can help people, where it needs to be adjusted potentially or at least looked at critically. It's I feel as we grow and change, Mitch is very much an avatar of the spirit of this place. So I want to welcome to the stage Mr. Mitch Horowitz. He is a historian of alternative spirituality. He's one of today's most literate voices of esoteric, mysticism, and the occult. He's a writer in residence at New York Public Library, a PEN Award-winning author of books such as tonight's Occult America, as well as One Simple Idea, The Miracle Club, Daydream Believer, and Uncertain Places, and the recently released Modern Occultism. We are here in part to celebrate the audiobook release of Occult America, and but you're here to enjoy the mellifluous tones of his voice in person. So that was published in 2009, so I don't know if you've been paying attention, but a lot has changed in America since then, so I think there will be some things to expound upon tonight. So without further ado, please put your hands together for Mr. Mitch Horowitz.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all so much, and I prevailed upon my friends at PRS to have the podium on the stage, even though I have never once used it. Maybe tonight will be the night, but we'll see. I want to quickly shout out to some friends who are here. A dear friend, the artist of the macabre, Chet Zar, is here in the front row. And you know Chet's work, some of you. It's absolutely fantastic. You can find it in the bookstore. The mad creators of what's the new magazine called, Jacqueline? The Bibliomancers are here, and they are fantastic, and they're going to be putting up a presentation on Tuesday night, which we'll be here for, and I encourage you all to come. My very first book, Occult America, and my start in this field took place on this stage. It is that simple. And I would not have found my way as a historian of the occult and someone who writes practically on esoteric spirituality had it not been for this place and this podium. And I hope to accomplish three things in tonight's presentation. The first is I want to say something about the gestation of the book Occult America, not only because it got its start here at PRS, but because I hope that some of you here tonight will find within what I'm going to describe to you about the making of that book, and I'll describe it briefly, something that will feed your own pursuits in terms of whatever it is you're trying to project, accomplish, concretize into the world. I also want to talk with you very frankly about aspects of the book that I personally feel were insufficient, things that I left out of the book at the time. We're here, in a sense, celebrating what is near the 15th anniversary of the book. As Alex referenced, it's being released in a new audio edition with my narration. When the book first came out in 2009, I didn't have the clout to do the narration. I was not permitted to do it. It was handed to an actor, and in the ensuing years I've narrated a lot of audiobooks, and I was finally able to come back and prevail upon the parties involved to allow me to go back into the studio, re-record it. That was a dream come true. And I was very satisfied as I was rereading the book, but however satisfied I felt, however much I felt I had accomplished what I set out to do in the book, there were also very distinct holes in the book that I want to talk to you about very frankly, things that I hope I have redressed in my new book, Modern Occultism. So I see the books as a kind of complementary in a certain sense. And third and finally, I want to talk about a hugely intriguing esoteric theory of the development and gestation of the modern occult, something that I referenced only in the briefest of ways in a single paragraph in Occult America, but that in the ensuing years I've come to feel is a really legitimate, if little seen and controversial theory about the instigation of the modern occult. It's very important to me as a writer, as a thinker, not to deal in questions of supposition. I don't really groove to people making connections without there being real joint tissue there. I tend to deal with things that can be documented by witnesses that we can really point to. I suppose I use the tools of traditional historicism, even though sometimes I explore things that traditional historicism either neglects or rejects. So I have a tendency sometimes not to go too far down the rabbit hole of theories that can't be justified with real hardcore witnesses, documents, names, places, dates. And yet, in the years that have passed since I published Occult America, this one particular theory, strange and serpentine as it is, has gripped me intellectually and imaginatively, and I think there's something there, and I want to share it with you. I want to start quickly with the gestation of this book. I'd say by my early mid-20s, I had really abandoned writing. I had left writing behind. After I got out of college, I was working in journalism. I didn't really like working in journalism. I was covering cops, I was covering a police beat, and I found that, I suppose you could say, I watched some of my colleagues really want there to be a call about some horrible car crash out on Route 91 that they could run out to cover. And that wasn't the direction that I wanted in my life. That kind of deadline reportage, I discovered through some very hard episodes, was not for me. I did a lot of good work, and I did a lot of things that I care about, that I'm proud of, and that I hold my head up about, but I didn't want to dedicate the remainder of my life to that world. And I went into book publishing, and book publishing was very good to me in a lot of ways, but I always felt like a fraud. I always felt like I wasn't really doing the thing itself. And no matter how many times friends or loved ones could explain to me, no, you're doing great work, I felt as though I was always harvesting somebody else's dreams. And there's a place for that. And there's a role for people who can do that and who can facilitate that. But there was a part of me that I had almost squelched down to the point where I wouldn't feel its irradiations anymore within, that was incomplete, was remorseful over not pursuing my own writing. But at a certain point, I woke up one morning, I found myself in my mid-30s, mid to late 30s. Today I'm 58, and I had one son, another son on the way. I had all the obligations that any number of us in this room have, and I was at that stage, 36, 37, where I thought that my life was settling into a template, a pattern that was going to continue. And in 2003, I was asked by a Positive Mind magazine called Science of Mind magazine to interview the MLB pitcher Barry Zito. They had learned that Barry used a lot of positive mind methods in his work, and they reached out to him. He agreed to an interview. So I was speaking to Barry, and he said to me at a certain point in the conversation, "You must really be into Neville." And I had no idea what he was talking about. And he explained to me who Neville Goddard was. And as soon as we got off the phone, I went out and got a copy of Neville's last book, published in 1966, Resurrection. And I was completely hooked. And two things happened thereafter. The first was the article that I wrote about Barry called Barry's Way, which is up online, came out. I was very proud of it. I thought it was a good piece. One of the things I attempted to do with this article, and that I encourage every writer to attempt, is not to feel bound by linear timeline or linear storytelling. You can find the connective tissue for whatever you're doing, whether it's dance, a piece of music, a piece of writing, film. You can find the connective tissue within your own internal experience, and you can explain to the viewer, the reader, the audience member where these points of connection are. You don't have to follow linearity. And that gave me a very satisfying outcome in terms of that article. About 2 weeks after the thing came out, I was sitting at my desk at a publishing company, and I got a phone call. I was told that Barry's father, Joe Zito, was on the phone. And immediately, my stomach sort of cramped up because Joe had this fearsome glass-eating reputation. And so I picked up the phone, said hello, and he said to me in these drill sergeant tones, "Mitch, this thing is terrific." And, he talked to me about liking the article, and he said to me, I'll never forget the words. I'll never forget the words. He said to me, "You stick with this thing," and by which he meant writing. And it was the affirmation that I needed. And soon thereafter, I wrote a historical piece about Neville. Must have been fall of 2004. It appeared in Science of Mind magazine in February 2005. And it was a short historical piece called Searching for Neville Goddard. I was shocked to discover that nobody really knew who this guy was. He was from Barbados, so people assumed that he was black, but in fact he was an Anglo-Barbadian. He was white. Digital culture was still in its relative infancy, and he was this very mysterious figure who few people had heard of, whose books were available only in these beige uniform editions that came from a publisher that used to be located in Marina del Rey here in town. And I wrote this article, and I was astonished by the outpouring of interest that it generated, but more than that, and I really want you to hear this, I came to realize that what you can do on a micro scale, you can do on a macro scale. Within the writing of that article, I found the kernel or the germ for what it was that I had hoped to do on a larger scale. As above, so below. If you can do a model of something, I'll say this, you can write a 5-minute opera, you can write a 5-hour opera. You have the principles. Get those principles. What you can do on a micro scale, you can do on a macro scale. Never forget that or forsake that capacity in yourself. And I started writing more in the way of these historical profiles, and I read a book by a British historian, now deceased, who some of you have heard of, named Francis Yates. And Yates wrote a book called The Occult Philosophy in Elizabethan Life, about occultism during the late Renaissance Elizabethan era. And the thing that Yates had the audacity to do was that she drew these direct connections between the occultism of, say, the magician John Dee, the Rosicrucians, early iterations of Freemasonry, different alchemists and magicians coming out of the late Renaissance tradition. And she demonstrated how these things were directly linked up to major intellectual currents that were going on in the Elizabethan era, such as, for example, heliocentricity, placing the sun at the center of what we now call our solar system rather than the Earth, a philosophy that appeared where? In Hermeticism, the late ancient Greek-Egyptian philosophy that had been neglected, that had in some cases been mocked, that was sort of dethroned from centrality toward the end of the Renaissance. And Yates said, wait a minute, if you go into the papers of figures like Giordano Bruno and other leading scientists of the day, you'll find that these people were steeped in alchemical and hermetic thought. And it defies good sense to suggest that there wouldn't be an influence from the heliocentric view of Hermeticism, the sun-worshipping phase of ancient Egypt, and the revival of the Copernican revolution, the acceptance that heliocentricity, church authorities be damned, is correct, empirically stands up. And she, Yates, drew connections between the thought movement called Rosicrucianism, a very elusive movement, a very mysterious movement whose manuscripts began showing up, written in German and Latin in Central Europe in the early 1600s. And she drew connections and said, now, if we look at all the various boxes that are checked by Rosicrucian philosophy, radical ecumenism, a belief in the initiatory experience of spirituality, a belief in the individual's capacity to understand something about the invisible world without any mediators, a wish to separate privilege from bloodline, a wish to separate church and monarchical power from the legal system and so forth, a wish to protect the individual search for meaning. And Yeats pointed out, look, you follow all these box checks and ask, where do they show up? Where do they show up next? What's the next stop on this train line? Freemasonry. Freemasonry. And Yeats has been damned recently in the Academy for no other reason than a kind of intellectual cannibalism, where for whatever reason, we as a human species, at least in Western society, feel the need to piss down on whomever preceded us, nitpick their sources, complain about a paucity of insights that in fact simply weren't available to researchers of an earlier age, and ignore the actual greatness of what the person accomplished. And I read this book by Yeats, which I recommend to everybody, and I wanted to do the same to the best of my ability for contemporary America. And I was on the phone one day with the president, the then president of PRS, Obadiah Harris, and he said to me, I was in New York City, he said, look, if you're ever in the neighborhood, our podium is open to you. And right then and there, I decided I'm going to be in the neighborhood. And I said, I'm going to be there. We must have been talking, I don't know, it was probably June or July. I said, I'll be there in September. And I don't care if I have to sleep in the dumpster out back. I'll be there in September. And I showed up and I gave a talk called The Occult Philosophy in American Life. And that was the talk, thanks to the support and ideas of some people around me, that morphed into Occult America. And I'll share one more quick story. I worked for about a year on the proposal of Occult America. I wanted to feel that I had a serviceable roadmap of what I was doing and where I was going. I'm also rather hyper, so it kind of came naturally to me. And having worked on it for a year, I got an agent, and she agreed to take it on and pass the thing around to different publishers. And so, of course, as always happens with me, as my partner Jacqueline Castel can attest to the truth of this story in psychological terms, the thing, must have gone out on a Wednesday, and by Friday, I'm absolutely certain everyone's against me. Nobody wants to do this book. It's been 40 hours. It's obvious. The verdict is in. I'm a failure. And so, coping with that, of course, irrationality, I woke up on a Saturday morning, and again, this was still, the digital days were still in relative infancy. We were still working with something called paper, which some of you in this room have heard of. And I printed out whatever it was that I had of the manuscript. I must have had maybe, I don't know, about a third of it done at that point. I punched holes in it. I went to the library. I punched holes in it. I put it in a binder, and I swore to myself that if I don't get a publisher for this book, I will write it anyway. I will build it brick by brick by brick from the inside out. Now, of course, by Tuesday, I already had phone calls from publishers, and we were setting up meetings, and we had something cooking by the end of the week. But I'd like to feel that it was such an important step to say, damn the torpedoes, damn whatever funding and approbation I'm seeking from institutions, I'm going to write this book. Whatever happens, I am writing this book. And again, I have this psychological malady that if 45 minutes passes and I haven't been able to actualize what I wanted, the world is over. But in some ways that's helpful because it put a determination at my back that I was going to do it. And I'll never forget this. When the book contract came to my house. These were the old days. They messengered over the contract like it's the Magna Carta or something like that, you know. Now we just use PDFs, but they messengered over this legal document. It was January of 2007. My second son had just been brought home from the hospital and was in like swaddling clothes on the sofa as I'm like tearing open this manila envelope with my contract inside. And I thought, this is going to be some year. And it was. But I did discover, and I say this in all seriousness, I did discover that I wanted to write more than I wanted to sleep. And that for fixed periods of time, it is possible to go through outrageous sleep deprivation. I don't encourage it as a long-term lifestyle, but I vividly remembered nights where, for example, maybe we were on vacation in Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and I remember I was writing a particular section about Madame Blavatsky, who's on my shirt, and I stayed up all night writing it. I stayed up all night until dawn cracked, and then the kids were getting up, and that very day we were actually driving back to New York City. The point is, you have within you, G.I. Gurdjieff, the great mystic and philosopher who has been a tremendous source of learning for me, he made the statement, a simple statement, but never forget it. We never reach the limits of our strength. We never reach the limits of our strength. I know that ideally every one of us wants to dispense with the day job and such. And sometimes we get to, But even if you can't, or if you can't for a certain period of time, the strength that you have within you, to the passion that you have within you to do your art or whatever it is you want to do in the world. Maybe you're a martial artist, maybe you're an athlete, maybe you're a musician, maybe you're starting a business. The strength you have within you to do that is there, untapped. And I can testify to it. I can testify to it. And occupying this stage to give that talk made all the difference in my life. So when you see this video asking people to contribute to PRS, it's no joke. What this center has sustained is something that I can personally attest to. It was interesting being in a studio reading the audio edition of the book. Now, this goes back to the summer. And having a chance to evaluate the book with some degree of perspective, well over a decade of perspective. And there was a lot that I liked about it because I felt that I did get across the point that I was seeking, which is that these occult and underground and esoteric philosophies entered the groundwater of this country to such an extent that so much of not only our concepts in self-help and popular religion, but even our vernacular itself, things that we say all the time that we might just toss off. Attitude is everything, you can do it, never give up. These concepts would have sounded very, very weird to Western people 150 years ago. People weren't walking around at the Grange telling one another, never give up, you know, but these concepts and the fashion in which the mind is a causative selective tool, something that has become processed through so much communication that it sounds not only omnipresent, not only ordinary, but it sounds so familiar as though it's always been with us. It wasn't always with us. There were people who dedicated enormous swaths of their lives to considering ways that the individual could seek power in the world outside of any established institutions, ways in which, this is really an echo of the Rosicrucian movement in the late Renaissance, at least insofar as the Western world is concerned. The individual needs no mediators to seek a relationship with an unseen principle of life, and other sections of time, other dimensions, where there may be beings or forces that can be felt on and through us. And the power of ritual, the power of magic, can facilitate these experiences of the individual coming into touch with capacities and possibilities that are outside of any of the dominant institutions. For example, just the philosophy of New Thought itself, which holds to the principle that thoughts are causative. If one really believes that, if one really takes that seriously, at least as a prospect, and to me the greatest exemplar of that way of thought is the man I mentioned earlier, Neville Goddard. If one takes that seriously, it gives you a revolutionary tool with which to work. And I deeply want to see people work with those tools. There is power there. There's also disappointment, there's confusion, there's tears, there's all the other things that life brings to us. But there is power there. And that power, in some ways, has been repackaged and sort of sold back to us. What was it, the Clash saying? Turning rebellion into money. It always happens. We live in a consumer society. Some of you may have seen the other day, I'm posting pictures of my little Kleenex packages that say things like, seize the day. And it's like, I don't really, thank you, Kleenex company, but, I'll stick with Marcus Aurelius. I think that's enough for me. Obviously, these things get packaged and sold back to us in trite ways. But the ideas are not trite. The ideas are not trite. And if you can strip away the outer packaging, you can find your way back to those ideas. So I was happy with the book, and I felt like it stood on its own two legs. But I also felt that there were things that maybe because they didn't figure as plainly or as clearly into the mainstream culture that I left out of the book. There are individuals and ideas that I left out of the book, which I think I've redressed considerably in modern occultism. One of those, for example, one such figure who didn't appear in the book, and this was a failure on my part, was Jack Parsons, the great magician and rocket scientist who probably needs little introduction to most people in this room. And I write quite a bit about Jack in modern occultism, and I feel, at least speaking personally, I identified something in Jack's career that I very much want to share with you all. In fact, for me personally speaking, there was almost this uncanny symmetry to it, because it meshed with something that became very important to me before I discovered it in Jack's life. As many of you know, Jack, for a period of years, was not only a brilliant rocket engineer and one of the co-founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but he was not only a devotee of, but a direct protege to Aleister Crowley, who was in the closing years of his life, living outside of London. And Jack, in the world of Thelema, the magical system and philosophy that Crowley pioneered, Jack was considered a real comer. He was young, he was handsome, he was well off financially, thanks to the sweat of his own labors. He was an engineer, so he did okay financially. He was adventurous, he was fearless, he was generous, maybe generous to a fault. And Crowley was very interested in Jack, partly out of selfish reasons, because Jack was sending Crowley checks to keep him going. There's nothing wrong with that. And so Crowley had a pragmatic interest in him. And Jack maintained a group home in Pasadena called the Parsonage. Different kinds of people, bohemian types, would pass through it. Jack, for a period of time when he was a young man, it's very interesting. It's a different culture. He was a Marxist, and he was involved with other engineers and science fiction fans who were Marxists, which is unusual because nowadays sci-fi culture, it's a great culture, but insofar as it has a politics, it tends to be ardently materialist. It tends somewhat to be libertarian. You wouldn't necessarily find a bunch of Marxist sci-fi fans hanging around with one another. But it was a little different back then, and countercultures were capable of the unexpected. So if I sound nostalgic, that's why. And so there was a lot of different romantic trysts going on in the household, playing havoc with people's marriages and domiciles. I mean, the place turned into a kind of very, very emotionally complicated, sexually complicated living environment. And Jack had already been through one marriage, and he lost his girlfriend to a recently demobilized Army captain and naval intelligence officer who showed up at his door one day named L. Ron Hubbard. And here my troubles began, as Art Spiegelman wrote. And, Hubbard repelled a lot of people. They found him big mouth, obnoxious, physically repugnant. They couldn't stand being around him. But Jack liked him. And so this is what I mean when I talk of Jack being generous to a fault. You know, he liked him. And so Hubbard rewarded Jack's affections by stealing his girlfriend. And Jack determined that he needed to undertake this desert ritual to not only win a new lover. That was more or less secondary, but he wanted to find someone with whom to impregnate with a star child or a moon child, a figure who Crowley had foreseen as a kind of messianic world teacher from the magical path, from the left-hand path, one could say. And Jack, first by himself and then later working with Hubbard, undertook all these rituals, some of which seemed to have actual physical manifestations, including one night Hubbard was in the house and he was invisibly struck on his right shoulder, and he couldn't move his right arm for the rest of the night. A lot of things like that would happen while Jack was working on these rituals. And when he capped the rituals, who comes to his front door but Marjorie Cameron, who also had recently been demobilized from the Army. She was in the Waves, the Women's Auxiliary Unit. Beautiful, intelligent, extraordinary, an artist, a witch. She was enchanting, and she and Jack immediately formed a partnership. Lo and behold, Hubbard eventually not only made off with Jack's former girlfriend, but made off with a bunch of Jack's money, had talked him into this scheme where they were going to purchase and flip yachts. And all it required was just Jack giving him his life savings, and Hubbard went off to Miami and made off with the money, made off with his former, Jack's former girlfriend. And so Jack chased Hubbard down to Miami and was able to recover some of the money, and kept in contact with Crowley during the whole time about this. And Crowley was disgusted. And Crowley, his wits were still very strong in his elderly years, and even from Jack's letters, he identified Hubbard right away as a huckster. And he wrote to another Confederate of his, Karl Germer, who was a German head of the OTO, who was imprisoned not once but twice in a concentration camp during the Third Reich, and it was extraordinary that Karl escaped with his life. And Crowley wrote to him and said, "I get fairly frantic when I think of what these stupid goats are doing," and he was very frustrated. And he, after that, his relationship with Jack was over. He felt Jack had been weak and foolish, and Jack was pissed off at Crowley too. Maybe he sensed that Crowley's real concern for his financial well-being was just to keep the money line open, which is entirely possible, but there's probably a complexity of factors. And everybody had a falling out, and Jack quit the OTO, and Jack started to do his own writing and his own experiments. And it was just a precious, precious few months before Jack lost his own life in an explosion in his garage. He was working for a Hollywood pyrotechnics company, and he was blown up, although Marjorie thought and contended until the end of her life that he was murdered. And that point of view deserves to be heard. Jack, because he had been a Marxist when he was younger, he had trouble getting a security clearance here in the United States. So he was thinking about emigrating to Mexico. He was thinking about emigrating to the new nation of Israel. He was thinking about emigrating to places where he could continue to do his research and he wouldn't have to worry about the security clearance. So she thought there might have been some kind of national security apparatus that assassinated Jack. In any case, he died at the age of 38, very, very young, and he didn't get to fully realize his own independent work as a magician. And one of the things that he articulated in his writings, which are quite rare, most of the editions they appeared in are since out of print, but you can still find them online nowadays. he articulated this wish that magic be simpler. And he said, any time there's ever been a breakthrough in human thought, that breakthrough comes through some radical simplification of a process that had previously appeared to be out of touch. And Jack said, we in the magical world, we haven't gone through that. We need that revolution in simplicity. And I really identified with that, and I had been thinking along parallel lines really for months before I discovered Jack's writing. And he was rebelling in his way, as I suppose I've rebelled, against Crowley's ceremonial system, not because of his aims, but because of its thickness, its density, its liturgy. And if you, and I'm sure many of you in this room don't need to hear this, you've had this personal experience yourself. Maybe some of those experiences have been quite good, and I'll be happy to hear from them during our exchange period. But when you read Crowley and you go into the magical formulae that he created, there's so much brilliance there, and there's so much beauty there, and there's so much greatness there. But there's a density, there's a thickness, there's a liturgy. Sometimes there's a kind of community or congregational requirement which the individual may or may not want to participate in. Frankly, it reminds me of what I grew up with in a traditional Jewish household. I had an Orthodox bar mitzvah, and I thought, wow, you know, if you're into Crowley, convert to Judaism, because there's a lot of that stuff there. And I fled from that in my own background, and I fled from it in Crowley. I don't like this jazz where any mention of Crowley's name, you know, it's like you're mentioning the name of Voldemort from Harry Potter, and you know, you need to launch into some kind of how would I put it, some sort of a kind of disavowal. You know, almost as if the fee of entry to discussing Crowley is disavowal. He was an extraordinary artist. He was an extraordinary magician. I think, boy, I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I think that the Book of the Law in some ways, is an accomplishment of similar elevation to some of the work that T.S. Eliot was doing at the same time, Wasteland, Hollow Men. It's an extraordinary document. It's an extraordinary document by a truly great intellect and a truly great artist. So I don't want anybody to feel that I have a brief against Crowley. I certainly do not. But I'm not down with the thickness of that liturgy. And I don't know whether that's virtue or vice in me. I don't know whether that's a kind of distaste for, I don't know, excess of ceremony or congregational participation. But Jack was thinking the same thing, and I found that hugely heartening. And he didn't have time to develop it. He didn't have time to develop it. But it has been suggested, that some of the work Jack did, it was called the Babylon Working, and it was based on some of Crowley's magic. Some have suggested that maybe that cracked open the door to the rebirth of witchcraft, which occurred just a very, very few years following Jack's death. It was in 1954 that, well, actually, I think it was in 52 that England repealed the last of its remaining laws against the practice of witchcraft, and in 1954 that the English folklorist Gerald Gardner published his Witchcraft Today, which really instigated the entire revolution in witchcraft that has swept through our world over these 50-plus years since that time. So it's been theorized that what Jack did might have opened that door. The theological head of the Jehovah's Witnesses identified Jack's birth date as the instigation of the events of the apocalypse in the book of Revelation. So that was a bit of interesting theological history. And I really do believe that Jack left a legacy, but one of his legacies that hasn't been tapped is this legacy towards the simplification of magic, and a contention, and I talked about this last time I was here, and I won't go into it now because I don't want to repeat things, and I won't subject you to my vast theories about quantum physics and so forth, but the contention is this. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking about ESP research, parapsychology research, quantum physics, none of which I will treat you to this evening, but which I write about extensively in Daydream Believer, Modern Occultism, Uncertain Places, Miracle Club. I really believe, and I want you to just consider this, and consider what it could mean for your own life. I really believe that if the individual has a warranted conviction that the psyche has extra physical capacities, and I think that we have sufficient evidence of that so that it's inarguable that the psyche participates in worlds that we see, worlds that we don't see, in some extra physical, causative, or selective way. If the individual has a warranted belief in that, and I've spent a lot of time writing about parapsychology, ESP, psychokinesis, telepathy, clairvoyance. Let me tell you, sure as there are floorboards beneath my feet, the evidence is in, and it is bulletproof. It is bulletproof. Your psyche, which I see as a compact of thought and emotion, absolutely has an extra physical component. It doesn't mean that that liberates the individual from a complexity of laws and forces. And we have to deal with the laws and forces that we suffer on this physical plane, including death itself. But it's there. And if the individual has that warranted belief, then my question is it possible that the liturgy, the ceremony, all the various steps that one is directed to undertake sometimes in ceremonial magic, is it possible that that's not necessary? That within our generation, there is a simpler approach that we can experiment with, we can cultivate. Could the aware mind do some of these things without the crutches, however aesthetically beautiful they are, and they are beautiful, of ceremony and ritual and so forth? And, you know, I dedicate a chapter in my book, Daydream Believer, to the question, and I really mean this, of whether the wish itself, the focused, impassioned wish itself, is sufficient to concretize, enact, or select events. We can talk a whole lot about what the mechanism might be. I suspect those conversations are hugely speculative, but pragmatism as a philosophy requires results. And I absolutely reject the notion, very popular today in the social sciences within academia, that individuals cannot self-experiment because we have too many cognitive biases and barriers, like confirmation bias, just a clinical term for prejudice. We all suffer from prejudice, including the guy who coined the term confirmation bias. And these are problems that we should be aware of. Of course, you know, our psyches are selective. Of course, we have all kinds of blind spots and prejudices. We're human. But the notion that every wish to search, every wish for the individual to know him or herself, from Lao Tzu to Proust to Sylvia Plath, is invalid because they weren't part of a credentialed forced choice study in a university or marketing lab somewhere, it's preposterous. It's preposterous. You'd be asking, we wouldn't be worthy of the label human ourselves if we weren't capable of searching. So I'm really deeply interested in that, and I felt very inspired by Jack, although it was a long time ago, and we haven't perhaps done as much experiments as we could in the ensuing years. His writings also weren't very well known until more recently, but that Jack foresaw that. And there were other figures, including figures of the left-hand path, Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, Michael Aquino, founder of the Temple of Set, that I didn't include in the book because I didn't recognize their contribution to mainstream culture, although I think that's a lame excuse. It was a failure. It was a failure on my part. I write about this quite a bit in Modern Occultism. I think that Aquino has been underappreciated as a literary figure. His writings, in some cases, are really just brilliant and extraordinary. And he wrote some short works that you can probably find online. One is called The Diabolicon, which he wrote while he was still connected with the Church of Satan. He wrote that in the early 1970s when he was stationed in Vietnam, and he brought with him a copy of Paradise Lost, and he felt that that book was a kind of a canonical scripture. I feel the same way about it. And he devised a work of his own that grew out of Paradise Lost. And then a little bit later, after he and Anton broke, he wrote a book called The Book of Coming Forth by Night, which I really think, I mean, they're both extraordinary books, and I don't think that he, as a magician, a literary voice, a visionary, has been fully appreciated yet. And then fourth and finally, I regret not having included William S. Burroughs in the book. I've finally come to realize Burroughs as a magician. And if he were here, if he were alive today, I don't think he would object to that. I don't care very much about labels one way or the other, but it's interesting to see how mainstream culture will crack open the door just wide enough to allow in Burroughs, allow in Allen Ginsberg, allow in a few Kerouac, but they will only allow those figures in insofar as they are figures of literature and not spirituality, or to put it better, not the extra-physical, even though Ginsberg and Burroughs were profoundly concerned from different directions with the extra-physical, as were friends and colleagues of theirs like Brian Geisen and a whole wide range of people that formed their circle and their friendships. And Burroughs, it's mysterious to me, frankly. It's mysterious to me how we say yes to some figures and no to some other figures, or how we say, when I say we, I mean mainstream culture, says yes to some figures almost as a matter of course. Allen is allowed in, Burroughs is allowed in, just don't talk about magic. That hasn't happened yet with Genesis Peerage, yet. And Burroughs had this extraordinary insight, it seems to me, that because time and linearity are illusory, and again, I promise I'm not going to go into my different dimensions, intersections of time, quantum theory thing tonight, but because the linear experience is conditioned, we've brought that experience into our literature, into our expressions, and it's limited us, it's hobbled us. And he felt that what T.S. Eliot did, for example, with The Wasteland, I would argue the same for what Crowley did with Book of the Law, broke that open, cracked that open. And he theorized, maybe everything is happening all at once, and if you cut up sections of a book, the future leaks out. That was his phrase. And I encourage you to try it, as I think many of you have probably, cutting things up, drawing them, drawing upon your own phrases as you might draw upon tarot cards, for example. The other day I was having lunch with a very brilliant woman, and she made the point to me, look, there's really no way of knowing the future. There's no oracle or divinatory device. I think perhaps that's true. Perhaps that's true, as long as we are cemented into thinking of it as the future. We know, and again, I won't violate my promise not to go into quantum theory tonight, but we know that linearity is not real. It's conditioned. It's conditioned. It feels overwhelmingly real, and our lives would be utter chaos without it. But the simple fact is, you all know Einstein's famous thought experiment, which has since been proven, that a being in a spaceship traveling at or near light speed would experience, at least from the perspective of the observer, a slowing down of time, including physical aging. The fact is, and this is absolutely true, astronauts in our own era, even though they're traveling nowhere near the velocity of light speed, do experience minute but actually measurable reductions in the aging process. Einstein was correct. Time is relative. He once wrote to a friend, people like us don't believe in time. Those of us who are immersed in physics, we don't believe in time. It's not poetry. I mean, it is poetry because it's truth, but it's empirically real as well. Again, as real as the words you're hearing right now. And so, if one accepts that time is conditioned, one could also accept that a pictorial or a storytelling device like the I Ching, like tarot, like your own words, cut up and scattered, and then you pick up a few off the floor randomly, provide a kind of photograph of what's going on. What's going on? Past, present, future. It's all just conditioned language, just like ego. You know, show me ego. I can't touch it. Show me non-identification. Show me personality versus essence. These are all just metaphors that we talk in as we're grappling around in the dark. So are past, present, future. So it stands to reason, that, yeah, maybe if we think in terms of can I tell the future, that might be setting ourselves into a mold that's limiting. But if we think in terms of having freedom from this sense of past, present, future, and then use the tarot deck, then use the I Ching, then use the cut-up method that Burroughs ascribed, something starts to happen. I was very touched because when I was reading, doing background reading for modern occultism, I read a book that I'm sure some of you know called The Third Mind by William S. Burroughs and Brian Geisen. And right there in that book, and I had never known it, they talk about the facility of the book Think and Grow Rich and how they got a kick out of it. And of course, Think and Grow Rich is sort of like Aleister Crowley, right? It's just that Think and Grow Rich is on my grandmother's nightstand and Aleister Crowley isn't, but I'm supposed to disavow it. It's a terrible title and it's disgusting and it's gauche and it's vulgar. It's none of those things. It's none of those things. It's treated as a cut-up, treated as a cut-up. Why would you not sample a piece of literature? It inspired Geisen and Burroughs because in the book, Hill talks about people getting together and there's a kind of blending of psyches that he refers to as a mastermind, as a kind of third mind. That's what they were talking about. And I personally believe, you can decide for yourself, there's the best chapter on sex magic in Think and Grow Rich of any text I have ever read. Going back to the medieval period, going back to P.B. Randolph, going to Crowley. It's the best, finest, most practical chapter on sex magic that I've ever read, and Burroughs recognized it as such. Hill understood the force of sexuality, the force of sexual desire, to be life-seeking expression. And we, again, as we're cemented into thinking in terms of linearity, we're cemented into thinking life-seeking expression through procreation. But Hill, writing in 1937, and a man who came from the Deep South, I think making points that were quite heterodox at the time, said physical procreation is just one form of the sexual impulse-seeking expression. Sexuality is life itself seeking expression in terms of whatever it is you're doing. You could be doing something athletic. You could be paying your taxes. You could be starting a business. You could be painting. You could be delivering a talk. And Hill's formula was that at certain times and places, completely of your own choosing, totally private, you don't have to tell anybody what you're doing, you don't have to abstain from sexuality, there's no such recipe present. At times of your own choosing and places, when you feel the sexual urge rising up within you, well, what do? Well, You satisfy it maybe with a partner or by yourself. You ignore it because you're on the bus and you're not that kind of a person. But Hill said there's another option, and through a shift of your thoughts, you can take that sexual urge that you feel and put it at the back of whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And he called it sex transmutation. And I've looked into whether Hill was reading Wilhelm Reich, whether Hill was reading Crowley, or anybody who was writing about sex magic. I found no such evidence. And look, it is possible that, I always say to people that when people who are separated by language or culture or distance or geography come up with similar ideas, there may be a scent trail of something true there. That may be one way that we share common experiences. It's entirely possible that he didn't get it from anybody. He came up with it himself. I really don't know, but I've never found any tissue of connection. But I was very touched to see Burroughs and Geisen speaking about their experiences with this book, because it's the kind of book that educated people are embarrassed to be seen with. Like, oh God, it looks like, my friends are going to think I'm an asshole, and this seems so vulgar and gauche. And yet, we mustn't close ourselves off to these experiences. I think that's one of the basic ethics of Cut Up. So those were some things that weren't in that book. There was something that was in that book, which I mentioned at the top of the talk, and which I'm now going to turn to. And I dedicated only a paragraph to it. And I dedicate a lot more space to it in modern occultism, and I do so because I've come to feel that there may be something there. It's called the hidden hand theory. The hidden hand theory postulates an alternative set of events that reignited occultism in this country and in other parts of the modern world. Now, here's the standard nickel history of modern occultism. And there's probably truth to it. The standard nickel history is that, and I write about this in Occult America, and I'm proud of tracing it out. I think there's truth to it. Big reflowering of occultism during the Renaissance in Europe, big backlash against it. The 30 Years' War gets fought, and from 1618 to 1648, Europe, Central Europe, this German-speaking region between Prague and Bohemia in the east and the Rhine Valley in the west is just devastated. And that was the area where a lot of occult experimentation was going on. So a lot of people in that region of Europe and elsewhere make the very, very dangerous journey across the Atlantic. Some of them actually arrive to come to the American colonies, and it's the height of ironies, because bitter ironies, because not only is the slave trade in full swing, not only is the culture, the civilization of the Native American population on its way to being eradicated, but with all these things going on at the same time, there is a relatively stable degree of religious freedom in the colonies, at least compared to what's known throughout the rest of the world. And word of this spreads. And so you have these little colonies, the Shakers in upstate New York, the Ephrata colony in Pennsylvania, the Hermetic colony of Johannes Kelpius on the banks of the Wissahickon Creek outside of Philadelphia. You have these different religious experiments bubbling up. And fast forward to 1848 in the burned over district of central New York, which for many and mysterious reasons was a kind of ground zero for everything that was novel and radical in terms of social reform, in terms of occult experimentation, in terms of new religions. Kate and Margaret Fox, in their little log cabin outside the city of Rochester, tell their shocked Methodist parents that the bangs and raps being heard throughout the cabin are spirit raps, and people descend on the cabin. They investigate the Fox sisters. Everybody from a New York State Supreme Court Justice named John Simons to the reformist newspaper editor Horace Greeley, investigate the girls, and they say, well, they're telling the truth. And the philosophy of spiritualism, seances, talking to the dead, spreads very, very quickly across the country. And not only that, but spiritualism as a movement gives women their first voice as religious and civic leaders in modern life, almost anywhere in the world. Most of the spirit mediums throughout the 19th century, and this is not uncommon today, of course, were women. And spiritualism formed itself into clubs, societies, started its own newspapers, ran its own candidates for office. Spiritualism really becomes both a spiritual and both an occult and a civic and political movement. And women who want a voice in that movement flock into spiritualism. It's maybe 6 months later, about 40 miles down the road, in the burned-over district of upstate New York, along a carriage path, what is now U.S. Route 20, that the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights is held. And it's no coincidence. It's no coincidence that it's effectively down the road from the Fox sisters, because people who are involved in spiritualism, I'll put it this way, you couldn't find a suffragist activist who had not spent time at the seance table, and vice versa. You couldn't find a medium who hadn't spent time in the suffragist movement. Susan B. Anthony herself, who later in life was an atheist and a free thinker, but Susan B. Anthony herself, when she was a young woman, wrote to her colleague Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she was telling Stanton how she felt nervous speaking publicly. She felt nervous speaking from public podiums. And she wrote these words, not a trace of cynicism in them, not a trace of irony in them. She wrote these words, "Oh, how I wish I could be a spirit medium for just 2 weeks." Because she looked upon spirit mediums, these women who were communicating with the invisible world, as these exemplary figures. They're speaking in public. People hadn't even seen a woman deliver a homily in public before. In Occult America, I read about Jemima Wilkinson, known as the public universal friend. She was a spirit medium, a channel from the state of Rhode Island. When people saw Jemima, the public universal friend, speaking in public, this goes back to the time of the War of Independence, 1775, 1776, they were blown away. More so by seeing a woman speak in public than by Jemima's supernatural claims about herself. So all this stuff is very real. And eventually along comes Madame Blavatsky in the 1870s, and all bets are off. And the occult revolution is spreading around the world, and nobody can stop it. And eventually, with economic growth, migration moves out here to California. Southern California becomes the springboard of the New Age, and we live in the world that we occupy now. That's the conventional storyline, and there's truth to it. There's absolutely truth to it. But there's another storyline that I want to share with you that runs very contrary to this, although the names and faces and locales are all the same. Dig this storyline. This is the hidden hand theory. Now, I dedicated a paragraph to this, as I said, in Occult America. One paragraph. I felt it had something. And in the years that have passed, I've come to feel more and more that it has something. And my reasons for that are because the theory that I'm about to describe to you is something that has been written about in a very, very wide diffusion of places. A lot of different enormously capable, intelligent people on the occult scene, like the French traditionalist philosopher René Guénon, like the American suffragist and spiritualist Emma Hardin Britton, like Madame Blavatsky's sister Vera, people who didn't know one another and probably wouldn't have liked one another if they did. They all wrote in their diaries, their books, their articles about the theory that I'm going to describe to you. And let me tell you, there were many, many different people, some of whom did not get along at all, like René Guénon, for example, hated theosophy, but he nonetheless wrote about things that people within the theosophy movement, such as Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, also wrote about, and there were points of agreement where there were points of agreement in no other areas. So if I'm telling you that I'm applying a certain sniff test to what I'm about to describe to you, which is going to sound fairly wild, I'm doing so because this theory has traversed the work of many, many 19th century and early 20th century writers, occultists, social radicals, who otherwise had very little in common. And the theory is this. A secretive occult fraternity in Europe and North Africa, specifically Egypt, grew concerned around 1840 that dogmatic materialism, dogmatic physicalism, was completely coming to rule the roost in America and Europe, and that there needed to be some pushback against this so that the entire Western world wouldn't just be given over to this orthodox materialism, this belief that matter creates itself, your mind is nothing other than bubbles that appear in a glass of carbonated water, which is the brain, and when the water's gone, the bubbles are gone, and that's it, folks. And there was great fear that humanity was losing a sense of participating in a world that went beyond the physical. So within this fraternity, you had three different factions. So-called liberal brothers, so-called conservative brothers, and brothers of the left-hand path. The liberal brothers wanted to use occultism to help the social order. The conservative brothers wanted occultism to be something that was just the parcel and property of a very, very small group of people. And the brothers of the left-hand path wanted to use occultism for their own self-interested and very often inscrutable purposes. The liberal brothers were able to persuade the conservative brothers that Americans would only believe in tactile demonstrations of the extra-physical. So the idea was that they were going to instigate the events of seances and spirit rapping and talking to the dead so that Americans and Europeans would say, hey, wait a minute, there's this whole other world out there. These instigations were not accomplished through spirits or unseen entities, but in fact, and Emma Hardinge Britton writes about this in a book of hers called Ghostland, which you can find online. They used certain mediums, very often adolescents, who could be placed into a trance and by powers of what we would call psychokinesis or telepathy, could instigate a phenomena such as ghostly spirit raps hundreds of miles away. And the idea was, we will instigate this ghostly phenomena, and the result will be that the Western world will conclude, wait a minute, Darwinism aside, materialist science aside, there is an unseen occult or esoteric dimension to life, and we mustn't lose track of this. And things, this will shock you, things went badly. And so imagine a human plan not working out. So they instigate this phenomena, which culminates in the spirit rappings at the home of Kate and Margaret Fox in Hydesville, outside Rochester, in central New York State. And yes, the whole country is fascinated by it. including Mary Todd Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln themselves. Everybody's interested. And everybody is absolutely certain that it's ghosts and spirits. And the brothers of the left-hand path, the liberal and the conservative brothers, are very upset by this. They're upset because they believe that there is an afterlife, but they absolutely oppose the doctrine of reincarnation, which starts to re-enter the Western mind as this ghostly phenomena builds. And this is a position, by the way, that is held ardently by the brilliant traditionalist philosopher René Guénon, even though he came years and years later. Guénon argued, as the possibly real, possibly mythical liberal and conservative brothers argued, that a human being is a totality in presence that touches on all these different worlds. I'm really radically simplifying this. But because the human being participates in so many different facets of existence, both seen and unseen, there's no means of replicating that human existence, either as personality or as just a being returning from the general life stuff. And it seems confounding because you look at this and you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, reincarnation? That exists in the Vedas, that exists in Pythagoras. This is a belief that is as old as human expression itself. And Guénon argued, in what I assume was probably the position that would have been claimed by these unseen brothers, if they exist, that those references to reincarnation and even karmic reincarnation that we find in the Vedas and the work of Pythagoras, or rather students of Pythagoras, these things are symbolic. We as a Western culture, we as modern men and women have misunderstood them. They're not referring to the individual coming back and going through eternally recurrent life cycles. Now, I don't agree with Guénon's approach. There are just too many holes, and it's too willful a disregard of karma and eternal recurrence, or what we would call reincarnation. It does not work in my estimation. But I must emphasize to you that if you go back and you read the source material in which Guénon writes about this, he writes about it in one of his early books called The Spiritist Fallacy. You'll be amazed at the strength and the power and the potency of the argument. Brilliant men and women can be wrong, and I think that this was a brilliant man who was wrong. But there's potency in the argument, and it deserves consideration. So the liberal and the conservative brothers are unhappy because they feel, oh, now there's this craze over reincarnation that's sweeping the Western world, and we didn't intend for any of this to happen, and we've got to put a stop to this, and we need to find an occult agent, and this agent has got to go to America and set Americans straight on what spiritualism really is, and it's got to be someone strong and brilliant and a genius, and who will it be? Aha! And they use astrological analysis, and they find Madame H.P. Blavatsky. She becomes their lion. And so they contact Madame Blavatsky, and who did say, she always said she was sent to America on purpose. She was sent to America with a mission. She was sent to America by a certain brotherhood. So they reach out to Madame Blavatsky, and I must tell you, I mean, this story, which might sound to you at this point like Harry Potter, is culled from many, many different sources. Because many different people have written about it piecemeal. And so they contact Madame Blavatsky. And this is about 1870. And Madame Blavatsky says, I'll do it. I'll go to America and I'll straighten everybody out. But there's a certain unnamed occult order that I want to belong to, and you have to let me join. And the conservative and the liberal brothers say, no way. It's out of the question. Not only are you not going to be admitted to this unnamed order, but we want you, and at the time Madame Blavatsky was traveling back and forth between Russia, her home, and Cairo, Egypt. We want you to go to America now. And Colonel Olcott said she was given 1 day's notice to pack her bag, literally, and head to America. And she complied. But they underestimated Madame Blavatsky's independence. And when she got to America, she said, okay, I'm here. I'm going to straighten everybody out. And if you read Madame Blavatsky's writings, especially her early writings, you'll find that she was not friendly towards spiritualism, and spiritualists really hated her and resented her. She had a very, very different view of spiritualism than the common one, which is that we're contacting unseen entities, spirits of ancestors, and so on. She was very hostile to spiritualism, and that hostility was returned. So Madame Blavatsky, she comes to America. She says, okay, I'm going to come, and I'm going to straighten everybody out. But now that I'm here in America, let's get back to that discussion that we were having earlier, that unnamed occult order. There's a branch here in America. I want to join that branch, and you're going to let me. And if you don't let me, I'm going to expose your activities to the public. And so the liberal and the conservative brothers said, well, we've had enough. So in 1875, they placed Madame Blavatsky into a kind of psychic imprisonment, into a coma. And she's in this coma for 5 days. And her sister Vera writes about this. Colonel Olcott writes about this. And Vera says, Helena, my sister, she's in this coma. We're besides ourselves. We don't know what to do. Doctors can't help her. And suddenly, we get this letter from a master of wisdom in Cairo telling us, don't worry, she's going to be okay. And they're saying to themselves, well, how can she be okay? How does this person know, whoever this is? And within 24 hours, she's back, she's better, she's ruddy, her appetite is returned, she's feeling just fine. Turns out that the brothers of the left-hand path, remember them? They decided to free Madame Blavatsky from this so-called occult imprisonment because they had purposes of their own that they wanted Madame Blavatsky to attend to. These brothers of the left-hand path maybe were Hindu nationalists who wanted to free India from British colonial control. And lo and behold, in 1878, late 1878, they send Madame Blavatsky to India to instigate the independence movement. And if this sounds far out, let me tell you this. One of Madame Blavatsky's closest Confederates in India was a British colonial secretary named Alan Octavian Hume, A.O. Hume. Now, she and Hume, who was an early theosophist, did not get along because he disagreed with her descriptions she wrote of these masters of wisdom who were advising her. Hume had another circle of unseen adepts that he said were advising him and that trusted him to a certain limited extent. And he said that there was a group in Paris called the Association, and these were his masters. And Hume is widely recognized, as are several other theosophists, as co-founding with Indian compatriots, the Indian National Congress, which is the policy-making movement of the Indian independence movement. It's the policy-making body of the Indian independence movement, of which Gandhi later became the head. Hume said he co-founded with Indian compatriots the Indian National Congress under the guidance of advanced adepts and initiates. That's crazy, right? Well, Hume appears on an Indian postage stamp that was issued in 1973. So seriously does the Indian public take his contribution to the independence movement. Colonel Olcott, who I mentioned earlier, appears on a postage stamp in the nation of Sri Lanka. So seriously does the Sri Lankan public and government regard Olcott as a force who helped push back colonialism in Sri Lanka and reignite a Buddhist revival. And in fact, Henry Olcott's death day in February is celebrated as a national holiday today in Sri Lanka. He is the only American who's ever appeared on a Sri Lankan postal stamp. He's the only American whose birth or death day is celebrated in Sri Lanka. A.O. Hume is one of the very, very few Westerners who appeared on an Indian postal stamp. And nobody in the West knows about this, or frankly could care less, because if you go on the porch of the Stoics tonight, Twitter or X, and mention any of these names, Madame Blavatsky, you'll get colonialist, this, that, the other thing, without realizing that people who live in these societies and write their history and have stewardship over culture, the arts, civics, regard these people as fundamental founders of Indian independence, as did Gandhi. And you can read Occult America, you can read Modern Occultism, you'll find in there resource after resource from Gandhi's own words, in letters, articles, speeches, writings, where he describes Madame Blavatsky as functioning as a critical influence in his life, that he knew of Theosophy, her movement, as a pro-Hindu movement, and that she was the first one who gave him this notion, this was just shortly before her death, she died in 1891, who gave him this notion that of universality, religious, caste, and overall civic universality among all human beings. Now today, that sounds like just kind of good civics, the idea that everyone is socially equal, the idea that every religion should be given equal status, the idea of some sort of human universality. To us in the 21st century, that sounds reasonable and positive and good. To a young man coming from a caste-based society, studying to be a barrister in London in 1890, it was shocking and radical. And I will stand on Gandhi's words alone. On Gandhi's words alone. He wrote forthrightly about it until his assassination shortly after the Second World War. I could mention so many other things, but I reference this only to give you the warranted conviction that Madame Blavatsky and the shapers of the early Theosophical movement played an absolutely seminal part in the Indian independence movement, which dovetails with this so-called hidden hand theory and the brothers of the left-hand path freeing Blavatsky from her so-called occult imprisonment. And Annie Besant, who was Madame Blavatsky's successor in 1917, became the first woman and the last European to head up the Indian National Congress. So the hidden hand theory posits this entirely different gestation for modern occultism. And seen in a certain light, everybody got what they wanted. The liberal and the conservative brothers wanted to push back the idea that life was dominated only by physicalist material elements, and they gave birth to the science of parapsychology, which is not the only, but one of the most potent and unstoppable, empirically based, fact-based, science-based, and I define science as methodological replication, science-based pushbacks against materialism. Parapsychology may be among the most lasting fruits that has emerged from the era of spiritualism, when certain scientists like William James and J.B. Rhine and Louisa Rhine and F.W.H. Myers, and current scientists today such as Darrell Bem and Dean Radin, raise the question of whether in fact the psyche has extra-physical capacities and find increasing manners of replicating evidence in the affirmative. So that did grow indirectly out of the spiritualist movement. Suffragism was abetted enormously by the spiritualist movement, something that I presume would have pleased the liberal brothers. And India is today, for all its problems, and they are vast. India is today the largest democracy, the largest electoral democracy in the world. So, seen from that social perspective, you could say that everybody got what they wanted. But it provides a different entry point, a different way of looking at and considering the way these pieces moved across the board in the world we live in today. Of course, all of this could be wrong. All of this could be wrong. Emerson wrote, "There's more accident in history than we suppose," and I never forget that. All of this could have happened entirely accidentally. But I think it behooves us to know something about our history for the same reasons that I was describing to you some of my intimate process in making an effort towards writing Occult America, which is simply that there are agencies and levers and possibilities that we may not know are out there. And these things are not necessarily cause for despair, where we say to ourselves, oh God, you know, the world is just getting moved around by these invisible forces over which I have no control. There is truth to that. There is truth to that. Your health insurance carrier is going to rip you off. And there's not fuck all that we can do about that at the moment, unfortunately. I hope someday there is. I hope someday there is. But there are other areas of life, including the world that dwells within your own psyche, where you have power, you have possibility, you have tendrils of connection to other people and to ideas, and I ask you to use those things, learn about them as they have been used, and write that history for yourself. And I thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.